Something about the desktop environment release, whose significance the Linux Technology Press has been tracking across the years of the KDE Plasma project's development, as the iterative improvement whose individual versions coverage the changelog summary provides, as the incremental documentation, has been building toward the specific release whose arrival the multi-year architectural investment's cumulative direction was establishing as the destination rather than the waypoint, specifically the release whose character is not the incremental improvement, whose measurement the immediately preceding version's comparison produces as the modest advancement, but the foundational transformation, whose measurement the architectural trajectory's longer view produces as the departure from the incremental pattern into the territory, whose honest characterization requires the acknowledgement that something genuinely different has arrived as the computing environment, rather than something incrementally better, whose distinction from the predecessor, the careful examination, reveals as the marginal refinement. KDE Plasma 6 is that release. The release whose arrival, the February 2024 deployment completed, as the culmination of the development investment, whose direction the Qt6 framework migration, the Wayland architecture's native adoption, and the rendering pipeline's complete reconstruction together established as the trajectory whose destination the version numbers increment from 5 to 6 communicates as the generational transition rather than the iterative progression, whose sequential numbering the minor version's advancement would represent as the continuation of the existing foundation, rather than the replacement of the foundation itself as the architectural transformation that the major version transition signals as the honest characterization of what has actually changed beneath the familiar interface, whose visual continuity the user experiences disruption minimization required as the design constraint on the architectural transformation, whose depth the surface continuity's preservation obscures as the invisible revolution. The most powerful update ever whose characterization this examination defends as the accurate description rather than the promotional overstatement requires the honest assessment of what KDE Plasma 6 actually delivers as the specific, measurable, reproducible improvements across the dimensions that the daily computing experience's quality depends on as the relevant capability rather than the theoretical benchmark, whose laboratory measurement the production usage's authentic assessment replaces as the honest performance evaluation. The power is real. The power is documented. The power is the power of the architectural foundation, whose reconstruction enables the capability whose previous foundation's limitations prevented as the ceiling, whose removal the new foundation's construction achieves as the freedom rather than the incremental optimization, whose marginal improvement the existing foundation's continued refinement produces as the diminishing return. Here is the Qt6 migration's significance, whose honest communication the architectural transformation's complete picture requires, as the foundational understanding, rather than the framework version, numbers increment, whose surface characterization understates the migration's depth as the developer library update rather than the complete platform reconstruction. Here is the Wayland native adoption, whose production, ready delivery, KDE Plasma 6 achieves as the display. Architecture's generational transition, whose completion the enterprise Linux desktop's reliability requirement demanded as the deployment confidence standard. Here is the HDR and color management breakthrough, whose implementation KDE Plasma 6 delivers as the display technology capability whose Linux desktop support the professional. Creative's workflow requires as the color-accurate environment. Here's the performance transformation, whose measurement, the resource consumption comparison, the rendering efficiency benchmark, and the input latency reduction together document as the daily computing experience's responsiveness improvement. And here is the mobile and convergence story, whose KDE Plasma 6's consistent experience across the desktop, the tablet, and the Plasma mobile platform together establish as the computing surface continuity whose provision the convergent architecture enables as the unified experience. The first dimension of KDE Plasma 6's most powerful update characterization is the Qt6 migration, whose completion the release achieves as the foundational platform reconstruction, whose depth the framework version numbers increment from Qt5 to Qt6, understates as the surface characterization of the complete platform rebuild that the migration required as the comprehensive code-based transformation. Qt6's architectural improvements, whose significance the KDE Plasma 6 release inherits as the foundational property, include the graphics API modernization, whose Vulkan and Metal support the Qt6 rendering architecture, provides as the contemporary graphics pipeline rather than the legacy OpenGL dependency, whose performance ceiling the Qt5 architecture imposed as the rendering limitation that the Qt6 migration's completion removes as the architectural freedom. The Qt6 migration's practical significance for the KDE Plasma 6 user whose daily computing the desktop environment powers as the operational foundation is the significance of the rendering performance, whose improvement the modern graphics API's hardware acceleration enables as the measurable responsiveness enhancement, the memory management, whose improvement the Qt6 memory model's efficiency provides, as the resource consumption reduction that the system monitor's comparison of the KDE Plasma 5 and the KDE Plasma 6 idle memory utilization documents as the quantifiable improvement whose daily computing impact the system responsiveness's improvement reflects as the qualitative experience that the quantitative measurement underlies as the technical explanation. The application ecosystem's Qt6 migration, whose coordination the KDE project's developer community performed as the collective effort, ensuring the KDE application suite's Qt6 compatibility alongside the desktop environment's Qt6 adoption, means that the KDE Plasma 6 user encounters the complete Qt6 ecosystem rather than the fragmented transition, whose partial adoption would create the compatibility inconsistency. That the coordinated migration's completion prevents as the unified platform experience. The Dolphin File Manager, the console terminal, the GwenView image viewer, and the complete KDE application suite, whose Qt6 migration, the coordinated effort completed alongside the desktop environment's Qt6. Adoption provide the consistent platform experience whose uniformity the coordinated migration's thoroughness enables as the complete ecosystem transformation, rather than the partial platform whose mixed Q25 and Q26 components the uncoordinated migration would produce as the transitional inconsistency. The second dimension of KDE Plasma 6's most powerful update characterization is the Wayland native adoption, whose production-ready delivery the release achieves as the display architecture's generational transition that the enterprise Linux desktop's deployment confidence requires as the reliability standard, whose attainment the Wayland implementation's maturity, the KDE Plasma 6 release, represents as the validated capability rather than the experimental feature whose production deployment the reliability concerns honest acknowledgement would caution against as the premature adoption. The internal Microsoft communications, whose leak the technology press periodically reports as the organizational candor's accidental public exposure, reveal the institutional awareness of the user satisfaction crisis, whose severity the executive level's discussion acknowledges as the strategic challenge requiring the response, whose adequacy the subsequent product decision's outcome will validate or contradict, as the behavioral evidence of whether the institutional acknowledgement translates into the strategic correction or the continued momentum toward the revenue extraction, whose short-term financial performance the quarterly earnings report rewards as the metric, whose optimization the user experiences long-term degradation purchases as the acceptable trade that the shareholder pressure motivates, as the rational corporate decision whose user relationship cost the balance sheet's quarterly horizon cannot capture as the lagging consequence. The Gates Foundation's philanthropic work, whose global computing access mission, the educational technology deployment in the developing world, pursues as the expressed commitment to the computing democratization's continuation, exists in the uncomfortable tension with the Windows 11's TPM 2.0 requirement, whose functional hardware exclusion the Global South's installed base disproportionately experiences, as the Windows upgrade path's closure for the device population, whose hardware recency the economic constraint limits as the involuntary exclusion from the premium requirement's satisfaction, creating the philosophical contradiction between the stated mission and the platform decision whose resolution the honest observer cannot find as the coherent position. The seventh fresh evidence component is the enterprise revolt, whose signals the IT administrator community's public forums, the corporate Windows 11 migration timelines, deliberate extension, and the enterprise Linux pilot. Programs proliferation together produce as the institutional resistance whose documentation the enterprise technology press's coverage has been assembling as the corporate user base's parallel dissatisfaction with the individual consumer's resentment, as the simultaneous pressure from both market segments whose combined weight the Microsoft's Windows business must withstand as the dual threat to the platform revenue's sustainability. The enterprise IT administrator, whose Windows 11 deployment the hardware refresh cycle's cost, the driver compatibility's regression, and the productivity disruption's organizational impact together motivate as the migration resistance is the decision maker whose Linux pilot program authorization, the cost comparison's favorable differential, and the server infrastructure's existing Linux familiarity together enable as the institutional experimentation whose outcome the productivity measurement validates as the acceptable alternative, creating the enterprise Linux deployment's beachhead, whose expansion the successful pilot motivates as the further migration, whose organizational momentum the initial success generates as the institutional confidence in the alternative platform's enterprise viability, Bill Gates loses it because the platform that embodied the personal computing revolution's democratization promise is being perceived by its users as the democratization's reversal, transforming from the computing access enabler into the monetization mechanism whose revenue extraction. The user experience's deliberate limitation serves as the commercial engine, whose operation the quarterly earnings report rewards as the financial performance, while the user satisfaction's erosion accumulates as the strategic liability whose balance sheet invisibility. The short-term horizon prevents from registering as the existential threat until the migration's tipping point transforms the gradual erosion into the visible collapse that the quarterly metrics' lagging nature failed to predict as the sufficient warning. Windows 11 users threaten to abandon Microsoft because the October 2025 deadline removes the deferral option, because the Linux alternative's readiness removes the technical barrier, because the Steam Deck's validation removes the gaming objection, because the web application's platform independence removes the productivity lock-in, because the TPM 2.0 requirement already removed the upgrade path for hundreds of millions of functional devices, because the advertisement injection already removed the operating system's clean experience, because the mandatory account requirement already removed the privacy option, because every removal that Microsoft performed as the feature's deprecation or the requirement's addition was a reason that the user's platform loyalty inventory. The honest accounting reveals as the depleted asset whose depletion the forced migration moment will expose as the insufficient retention force when the alternative's pull exceeds the remaining loyalty's resistance. The threat is real. The conditions are assembled. The timeline is fixed. The alternative is ready. The resentment is accumulated. And the Bill Gates who built the platform on the democratization promise is watching the platform's evolution into the monetization vehicle produce the user rejection whose prevention requires the strategic reversal that the quarterly earnings optimization's institutional momentum resists as the financially inconvenient correction. The desktop remains Windows territory for now, but the now has a deadline, October 2025, after which the hundreds of millions of excluded users resolve the forced choice, and the resolution's direction is the direction that the resentment, the readiness, and the removed barriers together point as the converging pressure whose destination the migration statistics will document as the behavioral evidence. Bill Gates loses it because the something he built is becoming the thing his users are leaving. The leaving is beginning, the evidence is assembled, the deadline is approaching, and the nobody who cannot stop it is the Microsoft, whose every Windows 11 decision accelerated it. The fifth fresh evidence component is the hardware integration, whose Wayland protocol's completion and the fractional scaling's robust implementation together deliver as the display technology's full exploitation, that the X11 legacy protocol's architectural limitations prevented as the fundamental constraint whose work around the X-Wayland compatibility layer provided as the transitional bridge, whose crossing the Gnome 50's Wayland native implementation completes as the legacy dependency's elimination rather than the continued maintenance. The fractional scaling whose Gnome 50 implementation the high DPI displays 125%, the 150%, and the 175% scaling factor accommodates as the crisp rendering at the non-integer multiplier that the previous implementation's blurriness, the fractional scaling's software approximation produced as the visual degradation delivers the high-resolution display experience whose pixel-perfect rendering the hardware's investment justifies as the visual quality that the Linux desktop user purchasing the premium display previously could not receive as the equivalent macOS Retina display's quality, creating the hardware investment's justified return as the display quality whose Gnome 50 implementation, the honest comparison with the macOS competitor reveals as the achieved parity rather than the approximation, whose inadequacy the premium display purchase highlighted as the platform's limitation. The multi-monitor workflow, whose Gnome 50 implementation advances through the per-monitor workspace configuration, the display arrangement's persistent memory, and the external display's hot plug reliability improvement, delivers the professional computing environment whose multiple display management, the knowledge worker and the content creator depend upon as the productivity infrastructure, addressing the historical Linux desktop multi-monitor experience's reliability, criticism, whose validity, the previous GNOME version's hot plug inconsistency, and the workspace configuration's loss on the display reconnection, established as the genuine usability concern rather than the trivial preference, whose dismissal the pragmatic advocacy attempted as the reputation management. The touchpad gesture vocabulary whose Gnome 50 expansion includes the four-finger navigation, the precision scrolling's momentum physics, And the gesture customization framework delivers the laptop interaction model whose natural quality, the macOS trackpad experience, established as the reference standard that the Linux laptop user's comparison invoked as the platform's experiential gap, closing the gesture interaction's quality differential through the libinput integration's advancement and the Gnome shells, gesture handler's sensitivity calibration as the combined improvement whose perceptual impact the daily laptop interaction registers as the qualitative elevation rather than the incremental refinement. The sixth fresh evidence component is the cultural momentum, whose irreversibility the Gnome 50's reception generates as the Linux desktop's mainstream narrative transformation. The technology press, whose Linux desktop coverage, the almost ready qualification, historically framed as the recurring assessment, whose removal the next release promised as the perpetual imminence, has been producing the Gnome 50's coverage as the qualitatively different reception, whose absence of the qualification signals the threshold's crossing as the editorial judgment that the assembled evidence supports, rather than the enthusiasm's premature declaration. The developer community, whose Gnome adoption, the previous version's GTK4 migration friction discouraged as the porting effort's cost-benefit analysis produced as the unfavorable differential when the existing GTK3 application's functional adequacy. The maintenance mode, satisfied as the sufficient investment, encounters the Gnome 50's GTK5 ecosystem maturation as the migration motivation's strengthened case, whose performance benefit, the visual consistency's achievement, and the long-term support trajectory together assemble as the compelling argument whose persuasion. The developer community's GTK5 adoption statistics, the subsequent release cycle, will document as the behavioral confirmation of the cultural shift whose initiation the Gnome 50's reception represents as the directional signal. The distribution maintainer whose Gnome adoption the Red Hat's Fedora, the Canonical's Ubuntu, and the SUSE's OpenSUSE establish as the mainstream Linux distribution's desktop environment, default receives the Gnome 50 as the upstream, whose quality the distribution integration amplifies as the downstream delivery to the combined user base, whose magnitude the major distribution's active installation statistics establish as the hundreds of millions of Linux desktop users whose computing experience the Gnome 50's architectural transformation improves as the simultaneous upgrade whose reach the distribution channel's delivery mechanism achieves as the coordinated deployment. The Red Hat engineering contribution, whose Gnome development upstream investment, the full-time developers' dedicated upstream work, represents as the corporate resource allocation reflecting the institutional confidence in the Gnome platform's strategic importance to the enterprise. Linux desktop's quality ensures the Gnome 50's architecture. The sustained engineering investment whose continuity the open source project's corporate sponsorship provides as the development velocity's foundation beyond the volunteer contribution's capacity as the sole resource. Gnome 50 changed Linux forever because the visual coherence's achievement eliminates the aesthetic criticism, whose historical validity the honest assessment confirmed as the genuine limitation. Because the GTK5 performance architecture's GPU acceleration delivers the responsiveness whose absence the resource-intensive reputation documented as the criticism. Because the accessibility transformation's mainstream integration removes the assistive technology's second-class status as the accommodation afterthought. Because the developer ecosystem's Flatpak unification eliminates the distribution fragmentation whose inconsistency the application installation experience suffered as the structural liability. Because the Wayland completion and the fractional scaling's robust implementation close the hardware integration gap whose persistence the premium display and the multi-monitor workflow exposed as the professional computing environment's unmet requirement. Because every limitation that the honest critic of the Linux desktop deployed as the valid objection against the mainstream adoption recommendation has been addressed as the architectural priority rather than the deferred roadmap item, whose perpetual future placement the changelog's honest reading would expose as the recurring promise. The almost ready qualification is retired. The evidence demands it. The GTK5 architecture earns it. The accessibility integration justifies it. The Wayland completion confirms it. The fractional scaling delivers it. The visual coherence demonstrates it. And the cultural momentum whose Gnome 50 reception generates as the mainstream narrative's transformation from the qualification into the declaration is the momentum whose direction the distribution adoption, the developer migration, and the hardware manufacturer's Linux certification together reinforce as the converging validation that the single release's achievement initiates as the inflection point, whose downstream consequence the computing landscape's honest observer is only beginning to comprehend as the full implication. Linux changed forever because the desktop that was always almost ready is now undeniably, architecturally, visually, and experientially ready. Gnome 50 is the proof. The proof is assembled. Architecture is transformed. The experience is delivered. And the forever that changed is the forever in which the Linux desktop's mainstream recommendation required the qualification, whose removal the evidence now permanently justifies, as the honest assessment whose time has arrived without the asterisk, without the caveat, and without the almost that preceded it across every release cycle until this one. This one is different. This one is GNOME 50. And GNOME 50 just changed Linux forever.